Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Slate Belt Heritage Center, historical programs and presentations held throughout the year. My name is Jim Paynter, and I will be your host for today's program, which will be the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, exactly 79 years ago. Before we get started, I would like to thank, for their assistance in this project, my wife Linda for her help in making copies of historical documents, my sister Carol for her help with the pictures that you will be seeing on the screen, Mark Blau and Dan Trinati for their video recording, Carol Hans for providing me with the valuable information on the Army Air Corps, their role for which her father was a survivor on that day. Also Karen Brewer, who would supply me with books she came across in her travels. Today I will focus on the attack itself, because the events leading to it will be a presentation in itself. And I can show you I'd like to show you the map right now. These are the position of the ships in the harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Right here is what they call Battleship Row. Here's the dry dock facilities, the tank farms, there was supply depots. This is Ford Island, the airstrip, and then on the other side of Ford Island was the Battleship Utah, and there's heavy cruisers, and these were destroyers and other auxiliary craft. There was 96 ships in total in the harbor that morning. So you can see it was quite a big harbor. You can see the Battleship California, the Oklahoma, the Maryland, Tennessee, and the West Virginia, and the Arizona, and last was the Battleship Nevada, and then the Battleship Pennsylvania was down here in dry dock, and the Battleship Utah was on the other side. This is normally was for the aircraft carriers, but there was none in port that day. So, as early as January 1941, plans were being made by the Japanese Empire by which they construed as American aggression in the Pacific to attack and destroy the American fleet in Hawaii in hopes that the United States would surrender and sue for peace. So, on November 26, 1941, after 10 months of preparation and training, a force of 23 warships, including 6 large aircraft carriers, left a secret base in a remote island in northern Japan and sailed 3,400 miles undetected to within 230 miles north of Oahu in the early morning hours of December 7, 1941. On that morning, one of the small 2-man submarines was detected at the mouth of the harbor by the World War I destroyer USS Ward. You can see this is a small 2-man submarine here. They were battery operated. They had a 2-man crew. They had 2 of their long lance torpedoes forward. They were 78 feet long, and they weighed 46 tons. And once their battery power was depleted, they were at the mercy of the currents. So, and there was 5 of them were launched from what they called mother submarines, bigger submarines. 3 were initially sunk. One, and we'll talk about the one that was sunk by the Ward, which fired the first shot. And then another one was beached, and we'll talk about that a little later. Okay. The USS Ward was patrolling in the defensive area at the mouth of the harbor, thus firing the first shots of World War II for the United States. This is a picture of the Ward right here. It was an older 4-stack destroyer. Or they call them 4 Pipers for the 4 stacks. The captain of the Ward, his name was Commander Outerbridge. He had just assumed command of the destroyer the day before. and his orders were to fire upon any submarine operating in the defensive area, which he did without hesitation. The ironic fate of the war was on December 7th, 1944. Exactly 3 years later, she was struck by a Japanese suicide plane, sustaining such severe damage that she could not be saved, and she was sunk by our own forces. The ship in charge of disposing of the war was the USS O'Brien, whose captain was none other than William Outerbridge, the same captain of the war 3 years earlier. Now I just want to move on to the first wave of the aerial attack, which was 181 fighter torpedo planes and high-level bombers that appeared over the harbor at 7:55 a.m. This is a copy of the telegram that was sent at approximately 7:57 a.m. and it read, "All U.S. Navy ships present in the Hawaiian area, air raid on Pearl Harbor, this is no drill." And that was sent about 2 minutes after the first bombs fell. So the first attack appeared over the harbor at 7:55 a.m. The second attack commenced at 8:54 a.m. and the attack was over by 10 a.m. Now, when I mention the battleships, you'll be able to know. I won't say the battleships, so I'll just say the name, because all the battleships were named after states. So when you hear that, you'll know it was a battleship. And I'm just going to give a short little summary here of the carnage from an eyewitness as he described it that day. 300 airplanes on the ground were destroyed or damaged. The battleship Arizona fires were out of control. The Oklahoma is in big trouble. Nevada is trying to make a run for the open sea and is being attacked. Destroyers Cason and Downs are destroyed in dry dock. West Virginia is sinking. California is torpedoed and in danger of capsizing. Oklahoma's troubles are getting worse. Maryland is hit. Pennsylvania, also in dry dock, receives a direct hit. The flagship Argonne is hit with heavy casualties. Utah is destroyed. Destroyer Shaw is sunk. The mine layer Ocala capsizes. Arizona is beyond saving, likewise for the battleship Oklahoma. I will now give you a short history of the battleships that were involved. There was 9 altogether. The first one you see here is the battleship Oklahoma. The battleship Oklahoma was built in Camden, New Jersey, and commissioned at the Philadelphia Navy Yard on May 2nd, 1916. Ship weighed 34,000 tons, was about 600 feet long and a little over 100 feet wide. She had 10 14-inch guns. That was her main armament, and she had a crew of 1,301. On the morning of the 7th, Oklahoma was moored outboard of the USS Maryland, which you see right here. That's the Maryland there. On the east side of Fort Island. She received torpedo hits almost immediately after the attack began and started listing over on the starboard side. Before the morning was over, the ship was hit by at least 9 torpedoes. And as you can see, she capsized. And the only thing that kept the Oklahoma from going completely over were the 2 masts stuck in the mud. And that's what kept it from going completely over. Salvage operations began in July 1942, and the Oklahoma entered dry dock at Pearl Harbor on December 28, 1943, where a decision was made to remove all usable equipment. Due to the extreme damage, the ship was decommissioned on September 1st, 1944, and sold for scrap for $46,000. While being towed to the mainland on May 12, 1947, Oklahoma developed a list and sank 600 miles northeast of Honolulu. She was a proud ship and a home to thousands over the years, but the ocean was where she lived and where she remains to this day. 429 sailors and Marines perished on the Oklahoma on December 7th. The next battleship we'll talk about is USS Utah, often called the Forgotten Battleship. Utah was moored on the other side of Ford Island by herself, where I pointed out where the aircraft carriers usually were, but there was none in port that day, so the Utah was there. The Utah was built at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation and commissioned on August 31st, 1909. She weighed 23,000 tons, 522 feet long, and she had 10 12-inch guns with a crew of 30 officers and 431 enlisted personnel. On the morning of the attack, Utah was struck by 2 aerial torpedoes within the first 8 minutes. The ship immediately began to capsize and the abandoned ship order was given. Most of the crew were able to get to shore because the ship was less than a quarter mile from land. However, 58 crew members were trapped below as the ship rolled over and drowned. Only 4 bodies were ever recovered. The Utah has a small memorial built, including a plaque that commemorates the 54 men still aboard. After the attack, an attempt at salvage was made, but was unsuccessful, and no further attempts were ever made. The Utah, along with the battleship Arizona, was the only 2 ships not to be refloated and salvaged. Now, just as a small addition to the story of the Utah, Chief Yeoman Albert T.D. Wagner had the ashes of one of his daughters, Nancy Lynn, newborn, in his locker aboard the ship on that fateful day. He was waiting for a chaplain to come aboard and for the Utah to go out to sea on maneuvers so that her ashes could be scattered at sea in the old Navy tradition. The urn containing the ashes of that tiny baby girl went down with the Utah. Salvagers tried to reach Wagner's locker to retrieve the urn, but the ship was badly damaged. Therefore, there is a baby girl aboard the USS Utah being guarded by 54 of the Navy's finest. Now, next one here is the USS West Virginia. You can see she is outboard of the battleship Maryland. This is the West Virginia right here. This is the main deck. So it almost capsized also, which we'll talk about a little bit. But you can see it's right down to the waterline. It sank in the mud. All right, now the battleship West Virginia was built at the Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia and was commissioned in December 1923. She weighed 32,000 tons and had a main armament of 8 16-inch guns. On the morning of the 7th, the West Virginia was outboard of the battleship Tennessee shortly before 8 a.m. She was hit by 7 Japanese long-lance torpedoes. West Virginia was also hit by 2 16-inch armor-piercing shells, which fortunately did not explode. Quickly, she began to capsize when Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, acting without orders and on his own, ordered damage control techniques that saved the ship, and she settled on the bottom on an even keel. Because she would have capsized, much like the Oklahoma did. During ensuing repairs, workers recovered 66 bodies that had been trapped when the ship sank. 3 bodies were found in a storeroom where a calendar was kept, the last entry being made on December 23rd. After extensive repairs requiring 30 months, the battleship rejoined the fleet on July 2nd, 1944. And she was also present in Tokyo Bay for the surrender of Japan in September 1945. The West Virginia suffered 106 sailors and Marines killed on that day. This is also another picture of the West Virginia in New York City with the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. in the 1930s that was taken. Okay, now we'll go to the USS Tennessee. She was built by the New York Navy Yard and was commissioned on June 3rd, 1920. She was 624 feet long, 97 feet wide. A lot of these, you'll notice, were under 100 feet wide. That's because, so they could get through the Panama Canal. She weighed 33,000 tons, and she had a crew of 1,100 with a main armament of 12 14-inch guns. She spent most of her years prior to 1941 in the Pacific area. On the morning of December 7th, Tennessee was moored inside of the West Virginia. And you'll take notice, all the ships that were moored inboard received a lot less damage than the outboard ships because they weren't getting hit by torpedoes. When the Japanese attacked, Tennessee was hit by 2 bombs. Additional damage was sustained by flying debris when the Arizona exploded. Trapped by the sunken West Virginia, after 10 days, Tennessee was finally freed and sent to the West Coast for repairs. Upon completion of repairs, she joined the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. After the war, many people thought that she should be towed up to Memphis and made into a museum ship. But as big as the Mississippi River is, it's not big enough to handle a 32-ton battleship, and whose superstructure, this being the superstructure and the mast, would hit the bridges. So, in 1959, Tennessee was sold for scrap, and her casualties that day were 4 dead, 19 wounded. All right, now we're going to move on to the USS Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was built at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia, and she was commissioned on June 12, 1916. Pennsylvania weighed 33,000 tons, 608 feet long, 97 feet wide, and had an armament of 12 14-inch guns. The Pennsylvania was the lead ship in her class, the other being the battleship Arizona. There was only 2 ships in that class, in the Pennsylvania and the Arizona. And if you look at the Pennsylvania, you can see it's identical to the Arizona. On the morning of the December 7th, Pennsy was in dry dock number 1 at Pearl Harbor, along with the destroyers Cassin and Downs, being ignored by the Japanese airplanes until 8:30, when both the destroyers and the battleships were hit by aerial bombs, starting serious fires. At 9:20, the dry docks were flooded to try to control the fires. The Mighty Penn was probably the luckiest battleship at Pearl Harbor on that Sunday morning. She was able to leave the dry dock under her own power on December 20th for the West Coast for repairs and extended modernization. You'll also take notice, all these ships that were able to get and leave Pearl Harbor within a few weeks after the attack, they weren't repaired at Pearl Harbor. They were sent to the West Coast, and that being because there was still the threat of Hawaii being invaded. That's why they sent them to the West Coast. So she left Hawaii on December the 20th for the West Coast for repairs and extensive modernization. Pennsylvania was able to rejoin the Pacific Fleet in the spring of 1942, where she spent the balance of the war, earning 8 battle stars for her service. In 1946, she was anchored with the test fleet at the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb site after radiological studies until 1948, when the Pennsylvania was towed to deep water and scuttled, 33 years after her christening. The Pearl Harbor casualties were 15 killed and 38 wounded. All right, now we're going to go to the California. The battleship California was built at the Mare Island Shipyard in Vallejo, California. She was commissioned on August 10, 1921, with a crew of 57 officers and 70 Marines and 1,026 enlisted personnel. She weighed 35,000 tons, 624 feet long, 97 feet wide, again, under that 100 feet. And she had a main armament of 12 14-inch guns. California was known as one of the Big Five, consisting of the battleships Tennessee, New Mexico, Mississippi, and Idaho. At 8:05 on the morning of the attack, she was hit by 2 torpedoes, which, because watertight hatches had not been secured, substantial flooding occurred. Only prompt action by Reserve Ensign Edgar Fane prevented the ship from capsizing. At about the same time, California was struck by a large bomb, causing more damage. Large capacity pumps were used to control the flooding, but the ship was slowly sinking. Despite 3 days of attempts to save her, the battleship came to rest in about 16 feet of soft mud in the harbor, with only her mast and superstructure were above the water. On March 25, 1942, California was refloated and repairs were made for the trip to the West Coast, arriving in June at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. After major reconstruction job, California rejoined the fleet in January 31st, 1944. The battleship was placed in reserve in August 1946 and was sold for scrap in 1959. Casualties at Pearl Harbor were 102 killed and 68 wounded. Okay, now we're going to move to the battleship Nevada. The battleship Nevada was built at the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, and commissioned on March 11, 1916. She weighed 27,000 tons, was 583 feet long, and 85 feet wide, with a crew of 900. Her main armament was 10 14-inch guns. Nevada spent the first 20 years of service with the Atlantic Fleet before being transferred to the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii in late 1930s. On the morning of the 7th, the ship was instantly hit by an aerial torpedo which caused the ship to list. Because Nevada was transferring power from one boiler to another, she was able to get up steam and make a run for the open sea. Hoping to seek the Nevada in the channel, Japanese bombers concentrated their attack to seek her and block the channel, which, if that would have happened, would have blocked the channel for months. After repeated bomb hits, the crew were able to run the ship aground and keep it out of the main channel. After the attack, the ship was refloated, patched up, and returned to the Puget Sound Navy Yard for extensive repairs and modernization, rejoining the fleet in the spring of 1943. Nevada went on to have a distinguished career for the remainder of the war. In 1946, Nevada was painted a bright orange and was used as an atomic bomb target test at the Bikini Atoll. Towed off the coast of Hawaii in 1948, she was sunk by naval gunfire. She suffered 60 killed and 109 wounded. One of the in this print here, you can see the Nevada is getting underway, and you can see a lot of the hits being scored on it, where the Japanese were trying to sink it to block the channel. We have another picture later on. I'll get it, and you see that it's more graphic. One of the heroes on the Nevada was Lieutenant Donald Ross. He distinguished himself by assuming responsibility to furnish power to get the ship underway. When the electric room filled with smoke and steam, he ordered his men to leave and himself to keep power to the ship until being blinded and falling unconscious before being rescued and resuscitated. He returned to keep power to the ship until losing consciousness a second time due to exhaustion. After waking up, he returned to his duties. For his action, he was presented with the Medal of Honor by Admiral Nimitz on April 18, 1942, being the first person to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. And Lieutenant Ross was born December 8, 1910, and he died in May 27, 1992, at the age of 81. next one here we have is the battleship Maryland. That was built at the Newport News Shipyard in Virginia. She was commissioned in July 1921, and she weighed 33,590 tons, length of 624 feet, and again, 94 feet wide. She was a bit longer than 2 football fields and as tall as an 8-story building. Maryland was the first U.S. battleship to be built with 8 16-inch main guns. On Friday, December 5th, 1941, Maryland returned her base at Pearl Harbor after a week of gun and fire drills. She tied up to the mooring quays on Fort Island along with the other battleships of the Pacific Fleet known as Battleship Row. Now she was moored outboard of the Maryland was the battleship Oklahoma. Now the crew of the Maryland had cursed the Oklahoma for tying up alongside them because they blocked the night breeze, which would ironically protect the Maryland from the deadly Japanese torpedoes. The battleship was hit by 2 bombs, which resulted in little damage. On December 20th, Maryland left Pearl Harbor for repairs on the west coast. In February 1942, with the repairs completed, she rejoined the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. On July 15, 1947, Maryland was placed in reserve, where she remained for another 12 years, until July 1959, when she was towed to Oakland, California to be scrapped. Maryland suffered 4 men killed in the Pearl Harbor attack. Now I thought 4 men should be recognized. One of them you might recognize. This man right here, he is Chief Boatswain's Mate Edwin Hill. He was serving on the USS Nevada. In the midst of the attack, he led the ship's line handling detail in casting off from the ways alongside Fort Island so the Nevada could get underway. In particular, Hill is noted for having dived off the back of the Nevada into the harbor, climbing onto the dock to release the battleship from its moorings, diving back into the harbor to swim after the ship as it steamed away, and climbing back on board to resume his duties. During the attack, Hill lost his life soon after performing his major duty of releasing the Nevada from its berth in the harbor. The Nevada was the only ship that morning to attempt to make its way out of the harbor. Hill is most noted for releasing the Nevada from its mooring, and then as the battleship began to steam away, he jumped into the harbor, swimming after the ship, and climbed back on board to continue the fight. He was killed by an enemy bomb that struck the bow of the ship, claiming the lives of Hill and 46 other Nevada crewmen. Several surviving Nevada crewmen, who at the time were young men of 18 and 19 years old, credit Hill with saving their lives by ordering them during the attack to take protective cover behind the ship's gun turrets. It may be surmised that this veteran Hill would have recognized that these young sailors, being completely mentally unprepared for such a scenario in front of them, would have panicked and at great risk of being killed, while on deck, prompting his orders for them to take cover. On reflection, these former sailors mentioned that Hill, who was 47 years old at the time of the attack and had 30 years of naval service, had a level of respect on par with the captain of the Nevada himself. And for his courage, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, the next one is James Ward. He was born in Springfield, Ohio, first-class seaman. He sacrificed his life on that fateful day to help his crewmen escape to safety from the battleship Oklahoma. When it looked clear that the ship would sink or capsize and sink, Ward didn't flee or hide. With only a flashlight, Ward stayed in a turret where some crewmen still remained. Without his light, the crewmen never would have seen the exit. Thanks to him, they followed the light and safely escaped. Unfortunately, Ward was unable to escape the turret himself. He also was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now the next two, right here, his name is John Charles England. He was born in Missouri, but his family moved to California. He enlisted in the Naval Reserve as an apprentice seaman in 1940. After active duty and training on the New York, he attended Naval Reserve Midshipman School in New York and was appointed as a midshipman on March 6, 1941. He completed training on June 5th and was commissioned an ensign in the United States Navy. His next assignment duty was Naval Radio School in Connecticut. Upon detachment from school, he reported on September 3rd, 1941 to the USS Oklahoma. During this period, he also married, and in early December, he was eagerly awaiting the arrival of his wife and 3-week-old daughter, Victoria England, who was due to arrive in a few days. He had never seen his daughter. On the morning of the 7th, just 4 days from his 21st birthday, John England volunteered to work in the ship's radio room for a friend so that he might have more time with his family when they arrived. On that morning, when the Japanese attacked, Oklahoma was one of the first targets. The Oklahoma took 3 torpedo hits almost immediately after the first Japanese bombs fell. As she began to capsize, 2 more torpedoes struck home, and her men were strafed as they abandoned ship. Within 20 minutes after the attack began, she had swung over until halted by the mast touching the bottom, her starboard side above the water. England survived the initial attack and was able to venture in the ship 3 consecutive times, each time leading shipmates to safety, but died during a 4th attempt. His remains were identified in 1949. However, he and 4 others were buried together and unidentified at the National Cemetery in Hawaii. In 2016, his remains were re-identified and he was reburied in Colorado Springs next to his parents. Now the next one here, his name is Doris Miller, but he liked to be called by his by-name, Dory. He had worked on his family's farm, and he played football in high school, and he joined the Navy in 1939. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, he was below decks on the USS West Virginia. When the alarm called the ship's crew to battle stations, Miller headed a gun magazine amidships. A torpedo had just damaged the magazine, so the physically strong Miller, he was also the heavyweight boxing champion of the West Virginia. Physically strong Miller began carrying the wounded to safety. Among those he attended was the ship's captain, Captain Mervyn Benyon, who was mortally wounded. Miller then manned a 50 caliber anti-aircraft gun for which he had no training, and he continued firing on the enemy until he ran out of ammunition and received the order to abandon ship. Miller's actions that day earned him a commendation from the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and the Navy Cross, which was presented to him personally by Chester Nimitz. And that's Chester Nimitz there, giving him the Navy Cross. On May 27th, 1942. Miller died in 1943 when a torpedo struck and sank his ship, the escort carrier Liscombe Bay, off the Gilbert Islands. Now, the USS Dory Miller, CVN 81, will be the first aircraft carrier named for an enlisted man, and the first named for an African American, and that is scheduled to be commissioned in the year 2020. Also, in 2010, his face appeared on a first-class stamp honoring great sailors. Okay. Now we're going to go to the battleship Arizona, which is probably the most famous battleship at Pearl Harbor that day. That was built at the New York shipyard and was commissioned on October 17, 1916. She weighed 35,852 tons and had a crew of 1,087 officers and enlisted men and Marines. Arizona did not participate in World War I, spending most of her time on the East Coast conducting gunnery drills. In 1929, she entered the Norfolk Navy Yard for a thorough modernization. In 1934, Warner Brothers filmed the movie Here Comes the Navy on the Arizona, starring James Cagney, Gloria Stewart, and Pat O'Brien, which by today's standards would probably be considered corny, but I enjoyed it because of the scenes showing the close-ups of the battleship. In 1940, Arizona was transferred to Hawaii and received a new captain named Franklin Valkenburg. Captain Valkenburg was well respected and liked by his officers and enlisted crew. On the morning of the 7th, as the attack commenced at 7:55, the Arizona was largely untouched until about 8:06, when a bomb from a high-level bomber struck the stern of the ship and did relatively minor damage. When about 2 minutes later, another bomb weighing 1,700 pounds penetrated the forward part of the ship to the ammunition storage area, where it detonated. And this you can see by this photo. This is the forward part of the ship. I can show you on that model in a few minutes. What it did was deteriorate the whole forward part of the ship, and the main mast here couldn't support its weight, and that's when it toppled over. In that instant, the Arizona lost 1,177 of her crew of 1,511 sailors and Marines. 93 crew members survived, with 241 crew members being on shore at that time. Among those killed were the captain, Franklin Valkenburg, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, the entire ship's band, 23 sets of brothers, a father and a son. Of the 88 Marines on board, 15 survived. There is still about 500,000 gallons of fuel on board that leaks daily, 2 to 4 quarts. And a lot of people say those are the tears of the Arizona. In 1962, the present-day memorial was opened to the general population. You can see that there. Elvis Presley contributed a large amount of money from a concert he performed in 1961 for the construction of the memorial. Now, another interesting fact, I tried to find who I thought was the closest one on the Arizona to the Slate Belt area, and the only one I came up with was Albert Charles Burkansky. He was born September 27th, 1923, and he enlisted in the Navy in 1940. He was born and lived in Mount Carmel, PA, and he is still listed as being on board. Okay. Now there's some interesting facts about the Pearl Harbor attack. 96 ships were in the harbor at the time of the attack. The first attack wave commenced at 7:55 and it lasted about 110 minutes, from 7:55 to approximately 9:45. Some say 9:45, some say 10 o'clock, but it's in that area. The Japanese launched 2 waves of aircraft. When Commander Fuchida called out Tora, 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 meaning Tiger, 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 upon flying over Pearl Harbor, it was a message to the entire Japanese Navy telling them that they had caught the Americans totally by surprise. The Japanese Navy traveled 3,400 miles across the Pacific to execute their attack to within 230 miles of Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, the United States aircraft carriers, their primary target, were not in harbor at the time. A total of 2,335 U.S. servicemen and civilians were killed, with over 1,000 wounded. Japanese losses were 29 planes shot down, 5 two-man submarines sunk, 65 men killed, 1 captured. Okay, now if you step over here, we can show you some prints. This print is entitled Daybreak of Destiny. It's the battleship Arizona, and you can see the repair ship Vestal is alongside. And you can take notice of the awning here. They were put up for the tropical sun, where they would have band concerts on the stern of the ship or religious services. And being so that was Sunday, that was put there for religious services. Now when the bomb detonated the forward magazine, it was up in this area. And in that photo you saw before, this is what you saw leaning over, because this area was just disintegrated. And what it did, it broke the keel of the ship. It broke it all the way around. That's why the ship wasn't salvageable. Now this is a print of the Oklahoma capsizing with the Maryland in the background. And the same thing you can see there, the awning was set up for the morning church services. And in the background you can see the Arizona exploding. And as the Oklahoma capsized, again, the only thing that kept it from completely rolling over were the masts stuck in the mud. Okay. All right, here's some more items. There's another picture of the USS Ward that fired the first shot. And again, this is a map of the ships in the harbor at that time. You can see the Utah is over here by itself with the heavy cruisers, Raleigh, Detroit. These are all submarines with their tenders. Here's Battleship Row, the Nevada, the Arizona, the Vestal, the Tennessee, the West Virginia, the Maryland, and the Oklahoma. And you can also see that all these ships outboard, they were the ones that suffered a lot of damage due to the torpedoes. If you were inboard, naturally you wouldn't be getting hit by torpedoes. And the large tanker, Neosho, was moored here. We have a picture of that we'll show a little later. And they got underway because they had 100,000 gallons of high-octane aircraft fuel on board. And the captain wanted to leave there because he knew if his ship was hit there, it would really cause more devastation to the harbor. So he got underway. We have a picture of that we'll see a little later. And this is Ford Island. This is the airstrip. And here's where you would go out to sea through the channel. This is Hospital Point. That is where the Nevada got underway and where they beached it so it would not sink in the channel. Here's where the battleship Pennsylvania was in dry dock with Caisson and Downs. More heavy cruisers are here. The sub base, which they didn't touch. All the tank farms containing all the fuel, they didn't touch them. The supply depots weren't touched. The repair facilities weren't touched. They wanted to, that Commander Fuchida, who I mentioned before, wanted to make a third airstrike. But the admiral in charge, Admiral Nagumo, he was a cautious man, and he said, we fulfilled what we were supposed to do. We destroyed the Pacific Fleet. He didn't know where the American aircraft carriers was, and he didn't want to make a third attack there because he didn't want to be surprised by the American aircraft carriers. So he withdrew and they went back to Japan. Okay, you want me to step over there or right here? Okay, now this is the battleship West Virginia, and you can see it's sunk right down to the main deck right here. This is the main deck right here. And what I found interesting here is the firefighting tug Hoga. I didn't know the name until I did some research, and there was only one tug in that harbor that had 4, and it's the tug Hoga. And you can see right there, they're rescuing somebody from the harbor. The Hoga went on to distinguish herself a little later with the battleship Nevada. Also fought fires on the battleship Arizona. In fact, it kept on continuous duty till the following Wednesday when it was finally relieved. And now the battleship, or the tug Hoga, after the war, it served out the war at Pearl Harbor, After the war, it was sold to the city of Oakland as a firefighting tug, where it remained for a number of years until it was going to be scrapped. And then the good people of Little Rock, Arkansas saved their money through corporate donations. They purchased the Hoga, and it is now a museum ship in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay. Now here's a picture of the California, and you can see it starting to list, and it was in serious danger that it was going to capsize. Fortunately, it didn't. And like we read, it battled for 3 days to try to stay afloat, and then finally it sank into the mud. In the background, you can see that tanker I was talking about, the Neosho. She's getting underway. She's trying to get out of the harbor. And she did, as a matter of fact. She went around the other side of the harbor to get out of and she was largely undamaged. The pilots were after the battleships. That's what they were after. They even completely ignored the repair facilities, which was really a blunder, I think. And the dry dock facilities, they didn't bomb them either. So okay. Now here's the battleship Nevada. This was the only one that got underway during the attack. And you can see here, on the other side is none other than that firefighting tug, Hoga. And what it's doing, it's pushing it out of the channel, and you can see it's down by the bow in the mud. It pushed it so hard, it's getting it out of the channel so that channel remains free and doesn't get blocked. That was a 750-ton tugboat pushing this 32,000-ton battleship out of the way. So the Hoga had quite a distinguished career. And on this model of the Arizona, right about here is where that bomb hit and detonated into the forward magazine. And what it did was it completely caved this in, and that's why you see that superstructure falling over, because there was nothing to support it. And it made a crack all the way around, all the way through the keel. It broke the keel up the other side about the size of a man's fist. So what it initially did was really, it cracked it in half. Most figures on there was over 1 million pounds of ammunition that exploded. And these are just some of like the propaganda posters that came out after the attack, a small version of it. Most of them were bigger posters. And I don't know if you can zoom on that. That's the Hoga as it looks today. It's all restored in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay. And I just wanted to bring this to attention here. This is the battleship Texas. Now that wasn't in Pearl Harbor at the time. This is a photo of it. It's called, this particular print's called A Texan in New York. And this was in the late 1930s. And the battleship Texas right now is the only battleship that fought in World War I and World War II. It is still a museum ship in Texas. And right now it is being renovated. It's in for like a 2-year renovation. It's going to take a while because it was slowly deteriorating. So it's going to be like brand new when they're done with it. And then it'll be open as a museum ship. But you can see it's a beautiful ship right there. So, okay. Now, I would like to thank you all for viewing today's program on one of the darkest days in American history. We are going to conclude today's program with the singing of the Navy hymn as performed by the Naval Academy Glee Club in Annapolis, Maryland. Again, thank you.
Israel.